Chapter 4 Holding the Line. The Ultramarine advance had been swift and decisive, yet the scale of the galaxy made a mockery of their efforts. No matter how many worlds they saved, ever more were falling into silence. Worse, the enemies of man had rallied and adapted. The 13th Legion began to take serious losses. At Larenthia, the 4th Aurora chapter was beset by the Death Guard, their signature tanks and heavy artillery being corroded before their eyes by the god of disease and rot. The Space Marines were forced to abandon their vehicles and fight a grueling insurgent campaign without hope of support or evacuation. From the echoing ruins of the Interrex poured the multitudes of the mega-arachnids, spreading across the stars in a deluge of chitin and claws. They were met by a company from the 22nd Nemesis chapter who greeted them with rad missiles and phosphex bombs. Through callous ruthlessness, they burned out the infestation and ended the threat forever, though at a cost of 2 billion lives and a dozen worlds being poisoned forever. On Pythos, the Imperial army united to combat the endless hordes of the Neverborn pouring forth. Eventually, the Damnation Cache was closed by mysterious figures in silver armor, but not before 1 million men and 8,000 Ultramarines were slaughtered. Ultramar provided recruits as fast as it was able, and soon the 13th Legion accounted for more than half the loyalist Astartes in the galaxy. But even this could barely keep pace with the staggering losses suffered in this grinding war of attrition. From every dark corner, new enemies emerged, and it seemed as if the galaxy itself had risen up to extinguish humanity. At the highest levels of the Imperial war machine, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the Ultramarines alone could not save the galaxy. But then, that had never been Guilliman's intent. Roboute Guilliman was more than a simple warrior. He was a statesman and knew well the value of propaganda. Thus, he turned to the one asset he knew was untouched: the astropathic networks of the Imperium. These mystic savants could broadcast information across light years and still bound the crippled Imperium together. From the moment he committed his forces to battle, Guilliman had ordered them to begin transmitting news of the Ultramarines' victories to every world and battlefront in the Imperium. He gave specific orders that these were not encrypted messages intended for governors and generals. Rather, they were open broadcasts to be disseminated to every soldier, pilot and gunner in the Imperial army. This was undoubtedly the most callous of manipulations. The most desperate of holding actions were portrayed as stoic defences. Every ashen victory a glorious conquest. Every foe slain was heralded as a triumph for mankind. Every meter taken lauded as a key stepping stone in the road to ultimate victory. Constant missives of the Ultramarines' actions were sent across the length and breadth of the galaxy, and slowly the tales took on a life of their own. Around campfires and huddled in crumbled ruins, men told outlandish stories of the 13th Legion, and every word was taken as gospel truth by those that heard them. In the minds of men, the Space Marines went from being warrior giants to legendary demigods. Shining angels whose bright wings carried swift death to the enemies of man. As the word spread ever further, the armies of man began to rally, soldiers looking up from the ashes and seeing one last chance at glory, one final ray of hope. Feuding regiments put aside their differences and stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the banners of Macragge. Retreating armies dug in their heels and held against impossible odds wherever the blue and gold arrived. And led by the sons of Ultramar, mankind began fighting back against the doom overtaking them. When the word-bearers invaded Mordian, the Imperial army under General Contralis stood firm against the traitors and their demonic armies. Across the midnight hives, they fought back, never breaking, never ceasing the fight. On the steps of the governor's palace, Contralis personally held the line with his men against the word-bearers, refusing every entreaty to fall back. Through sheer, bloody-minded refusal to admit the possibility of defeat, the Mordians held the traitor's advance long enough for a coterie of sanctioned psykers to undo the demonic summoning spells and leave the word-bearers no option but to retreat. Of the planetary population, barely 1 in 1,000 had survived the attack. Contralis claimed it was the highest honor to have served the Emperor so well. When the Telestrians invaded Jorthan, the sighting of a single Thunderhawk was enough for the feuding noble houses to set aside a 3,000-year-old vendetta. They opened their armories and storehouses to feed and outfit the armies of the houses they had been at war with mere days before, and as one, crushed the Xenos who profaned the Emperor's domains. The fact that the sighting of the Thunderhawk was in truth a fabrication by the Administratum was carefully buried, and those who knew, quietly executed. At the Battle of the Chorus Graveyard, crews of heretic ships mutinied against their cruel enslavers and seized control of the gun decks of their traitor battleship, Unending Agony. By the time their overlords had retaken the decks, they had targeted and destroyed 15 rebel frigates. The hole blown in their lines allowed Battle Fleet Solar to bracket the fleet and obliterated the traitors. The battleship's name proved a hollow boast, as not one ship escaped. On the Calidus Plateau, the Talons refused the order to surrender and fought on for 19 days and nights against the Nib without support or resupply. Their commander attributed their totally unexpected victory to the Emperor's benevolence that sustained his men better than food or water ever could. Triumph followed triumph, and soon the slightest rumour of an Ultramarines deployment was enough to change the whole course of wars. Veritable legions of rooted men turning and charging back into hopelessly lost causes, for now they could see the path to salvation. They could taste the victory. Through the most desperate and stubborn of defences, the Imperium had managed to hold the line. The blood of millions of martyrs had brought humanity a desperate moment of respite. The balance hung on the finest of scales, and the slightest thing could tip it either way. Chapter 5. Jihad. On Terra, a new cult had arisen to dominance amongst the seething masses and insane demagogues, the cult of the Saviour Emperor. This cult stood apart from the insanity for 2 reasons. Firstly, a decorated and lauded soldier whom had fought on the walls of the Imperial Palace led it. Secondly, it was supported by its own saint, Euphrati Keeler, whom had stood with Primarchs and Warmaster alike. Together they decreed the God Emperor mourned the futile bloodshed. Of brother on brother, and claimed any man or woman who died fighting the alien and heretic would earn a place in paradise at his side. The Emperor protects humanity, they preached, but so too must humanity protect the Emperor, and this destiny could only be found amid the fires of battle. This was an inspiration to the people of Terra. Instead of flagellating themselves for their sin of failing to protect the Emperor, now they were being offered a chance to serve him. It was more than a chance at redemption. It was salvation. Fired by rabid devotion and zealotry, the mobs turned their rage outwards, seeking any who defied the divine rule of the God Emperor. Carried in the bulk holds of dilapidated cargo holders and empty fuel transports, billions upon billions of imperial cultists spread from world to world. Everywhere they went, the priests of this new religion preached to the people, swelling the masses of cultists beyond counting and seeking out the enemies of mankind. These were neither soldiers nor warriors. They were simple tradesmen, artisans and labourers. They had few arms other than their zealotry, no tactics other than their willingness to martyr themselves, and no advantage other than their numbers. But numbers they had beyond counting. On world after world, the Imperial cultists spread out like tsunamis of flesh, hurling themselves upon the blades of the foe, determined to die for their God Emperor. Millions upon billions of ordinary men and women charging into the worst hells imaginable and hurling back the darkness with the light of their faith. This was more than a war, more than a crusade. It was nothing less than a jihad against all the foes of man. Rabute Gilliman was deeply unsettled by this development. It stank of the very fanaticism that had seen his brother Lorgar chastised. Still, the Avenging Son was above all a pragmatist. Theoretically, the cultists had the numbers and the drive to tip the scales of this galactic war. Practically, all he had to do was stand back and let them. To impose at least a rough sense of discipline upon the chanting multitudes, Gilliman exerted whatever influence he had to promote a corps of retired army troopers and Arbeits veterans to act as an ad hoc officer corps. These weathered veterans could not hope to control the rabid fury of the cultists, but they could at least direct it, steering it to battles where they could make a difference. They were the nucleus of what would one day be known as the Frateris Templars. With faith and fury, the jihad swept across the stars, their vengeance on those who stood aside from the fighting even worse than the fate of the enemies themselves. The madness swept across world after world. In every city or hive liberated, they would embrace those who converted and burn those who were deemed to lack devotion. Wherever the cultists set foot, men would not dare show anything less than total commitment to the Emperor's cause. Every man was desperate to prove his loyalty. Not even the most corrupt dared whisper against the rule of terror for fear their neighbour would inform the cultists. Manufactories gifted weapons and vehicles to the cult as signs of good faith. Public parks and private warehouses given over as barrack spaces. Even the richest and most pampered of nobles opened their coffers to fund the imperial cult, desperate to keep the braying mobs from their doors. The jihad soon took on a life of its own. The more worlds they claimed back, the more the cultists were convinced it was a sign of favour from the God Emperor himself. And every world liberated only magnified the power of the cult. The death toll was beyond reckoning, yet the more blood was shed, the more the cultists praised the God Emperor and prepared themselves for martyrdom. With funds and soldiers beyond count, the imperial cultists threw back the enemies of man. The jihad had become an unstoppable tidal wave, and nothing could stand against it. For the first time, it seemed the Imperium might do more than merely survive this galactic war. It at last had a chance of winning it. Chapter 6. Purgation. In the dark, smoky gloom of the office was a sigh. It was a sad, forlorn sound born from a man of middle age, uniform crisp to perfection and gleaming with general's rank pins. He sighed again and poured a glass of Amasec, the dark liquid peaty and aromatic enough to hide the scent of smoke swirling everywhere. Finally, he squared his shoulders and faced his adjutant, saying, "Well, Toran, let's have it then." The young man barely had any stubble on his chin, and he shifted awkwardly in his newly issued boots, so new and shiny they still squeaked when he moved. He looked at the data slate in his hand and began reading off the casualty lists displayed. It took a considerable amount of time. As the list went on and on, General Laurel turned and gazed out the porthole of his command Leviathan towards the devastation beyond. Crumbling towers still fumed in the grey dawn, and around their bases were heaped piles of the dead. Mighty grey bastions soared above, only to be brutally truncated and torn asunder as the ruins of men and machines burned around their foundations. Laurel gazed at his reflection superimposed on the wasteland outside and saw a man whose hair and mustache carried more grey than he was entirely comfortable with. Yet his spine was straight and his physique still held tense muscle. His chest was festooned with medals. He claimed to wear them to remind the men of the glory days of the Emperor's crusade, but now among these ruins, he wondered why he had ever even bothered. 13 decades he had campaigned in the legions of terror, and in less than 2 it had all been rendered meaningless. Sometimes he wished he had died in the glory days rather than live in this grey, shadowy existence. He was just a caretaker now, tidying away the last remnants of humanity's grandest endeavour. It had been a dream, and like all dreams it had ended too abruptly. General Laurel was shaken free of his self-pitying reverie by his adjutant's last statement. "Say that again," he said. Ensign Torren looked up and said, "There's an emissary here. He wants to talk to you. It seems the militia wants access to the prisoner camps." General Laurel grimaced. There it was. Somebody had to say it sooner or later. The militia. "Damn fanatics," he cried. "Bad enough they want to stick their noses into this war. Now they want to massacre civilians." Torren looked shamefaced and could not tear his eyes off his squeaky boots. He managed to mutter, "They did prove useful." Laurel threw his glass hard against the now wood panel of his office. It shattered and sent Amasek across the wall as he snarled, "Of course they bloody well did. We couldn't possibly have managed without them." He began to pace back and forth as he ranted. "How else did those bureaucrats back on Terra expect us to take this world? For Feth's sake, we were fighting sodding Astartes here. 2 years we butchered ourselves on the ramparts and got nothing except mountains of slain soldiers, and all Terra ever did was send over more ridiculous demands for advancement. I requested Titans and macro cannons, and they sent lasguns. Lasguns against the bloody 4th Legion. It's such a bad joke, it's not even funny. And these fanatics pouring out of every troop ship, they're almost as bad as the enemy. They come out of nowhere and demand to replace us at the front lines as if our efforts had been meaningless. Our bloodshed here somehow unworthy. Madmen and zealots, the lot of them, because I didn't have enough barracks to house the torrent pouring in. At least the enemy acts with some shred of sense, but these cultists are just insane. No matter how many the traitors massacred, they just kept going. The more of them got slaughtered, the more rabid the next wave became. They just kept piling the bodies on until they reached high enough that they simply could walk onto the ramparts. Even the 4th didn't have enough bolt shells to hold them back. If they hadn't escaped through some damn warp gate, they'd probably have just drowned under the weight of the dead." He was cut off mid-rant as his officer door slammed open. Silhouetted against the bright light was a bearded man, towering and looming over the pair of officers. His face was high and long like some equine beast, his wet, sneering mouth full of pointed teeth filed into sharp, jagged stumps. He was swathed in orange robes, embroidered with scenes of figures twisted in paroxysm of joy and pain as bright flames consumed them, and atop his head was a burning brazier. Constant flames leapt and danced from his head, heating metal rods that clamped down on his skull, turning the skin blistered and charred where they touched. He looked down at the frozen pair and hissed, "General, at last." Laurel looked up in fear at the man looming over him, but would be damned before he would show it. You can't come in here, Elbran," he stammered. The man's lips peeled back in a parody of a smile as he said, "I go where the Emperor wills. You should know that. The heretics could not hold against his will. Did you really think a god's emissary could be thwarted by a door? Or a jail?" "We've been over this," Laurel said furiously. "Those prisoners are civilians, not combatants. Light of Terror, I will not let you burn innocents at the stake. It spits in the face of everything the Imperial truth stands for." Halberan fixed his opponent with piercing eyes. "Innocents?" he questioned. "You dare protect heretics and blasphemers? Those scum bow down to the unholy and the demonic. They gave succor to the enemies of the God Emperor and sipped from the chalice of his wickedness. Any who stand with his enemies are judged and found wanting in his sight, General." Laurel ignored the obvious threat and rallied back. Throne's sake! They were living under the boot heels of Astartes. What else were they supposed to do? Bleed to them? Helberan twitched his mouth, and his eyes took on a distant glazed aspect as he quoted, "Is it not written that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the Imperium?" The two men locked eyes, and for the first time Laurel saw the fires burning in the depths of Helberan's greys. For a long moment the two stood still, something ethereal passing between them. Then General Laurel broke his gaze away and sat down hard on his leather chair. "Tell the gods to stand down," he whispered. "Sir?" stammered the almost forgotten Torrin. "You heard me," muttered Laurel. "Tell the guards to let the militia into the prisoner camps. Tell them to just walk away." Helberan rose to his full height, and his leer split wide across his face. Even without waiting for confirmation, he turned and stalked out of the office. Torrin clutched his data slate to his chest and said, "That look in his eyes, it was so barbaric. So savage, it was pure madness." "No," sighed Laurel, shaking his head sadly. "No, it was the future," he said, and turned back to his Amasack, determined to get drunk.